So one of the things, we want to think about, we've developed this model of prospect theory. And we want to say, well, if we believe that this is how people are actually conducting their thought processes regarding risky decision making, then we want to say, well, what are the implications of this model? Why does this matter? How does this help explain what we actually see in the world above and beyond those little toy examples that we showed that couldn't be explained by regular expected utility theory? One of the most important, and again, the most frequently referenced implications of prospect theory is the observation that people are loss averse. And when we talk about people being loss averse, or we talk about loss aversion, we're not just saying people don't like losing, because that's everybody knows that. But when we're talking about loss aversion, we're specifically referring to the notion that people hate losing more than they like winning. Or, like we said before, people hate losses more than they like equivalent gains. Okay. And so we want to think about expected utility theory could only talk about how people were risk averse or risk loving. There was no notion of these gains and losses. We still say that people are risk averse over gains, but now we're also incorporating this idea that they are loss averse. And we can think about what that means, why that matters. Okay. So again, we start with, here's our very typical set of axes, our S-shaped curve. So we think about, obviously this is our picture of loss aversion, because we know that it relates back to this prospect theory value function. But we can say, well, what does that really mean? So let's say we have, again, just our plus x and minus x, right? And we know that we have some value attached to a gain of x. And we also know that we have some larger negative value assigned to a loss of x. Okay. And if we were asked, what choices we would be willing to undertake or what trades we would be willing to undertake, we'd say, well, I'd be willing, not surprisingly, to pay for a gain, but in order to subject myself to a loss, I would need to be paid to subject myself to a loss. That's pretty obvious, right? So here, you would have a willing to pay for a gain of x. How much would you be willing to pay in order to get a gain of x? In terms of value units. Because obviously in terms of dollars, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But in terms of value units, how much would you be willing to give up in order to get a gain of x? So you would be willing to give up something as long as you're like, oh, well, I would trade something worth v of x to get a gain of x because that would give me back v of x. That would put me back at a 0 point, right? So, your willingness to pay for something that's considered a gain of x would be, I'll say some item, I don't even care what it is, worth v of plus x. I even took money out of the picture, right? But now let's do this other way around. If we need to be paid in order to accept losses, then by this same logic, we would say, well, how much would we have to be compensated in order to accept a loss of x? This is basically, think of an example. How much would I have to pay you for the right to punch you in the face or something, right? Because if punching you in the face you incur some loss, how much would you have to be compensated in order to be willing to undertake that transaction? You would need to be, if you're seeing being punched in the face as a loss of x, you would need to be compensated with something that gives you, technically speaking, the negative of the value of negative x, right? So you'd need an item worth negative v of negative x, because you would have to be compensated with something that would give you positive value again, to get you back to that neutral point. This was probably because I was trying to make it as abstract as possible, probably a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, because usually we just think about this in terms of dollars, right? But the point is, here, that the value of plus x is not equal to the negative of the value of negative x. So we're getting some sort of discrepancy between our willingness to pay for an item and our willingness to accept to, for example, give up that item. And that's something that in traditional economics we don't really understand, that we usually think in terms of one valuation. That if I have something worth $5, I would pay up to $5 to get it. I would sell it for anything $5 or above. That's what typical traditional economics assumes. When we think about how much you would have to be compensated and think about, well, the amount of compensation would be the amount required to get you back to your reference point, we can see that there's going to be a wedge between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. That's that's describing this loss aversion, that we're irrationally, at least economically speaking, averse to giving things up or incurring losses compared to the compensation or the amount we would be willing to pay in order to get a gain. And so for next time, I'm going to ask you to think about the age-old question of airplane seat reclining. You're going to have a discussion question on prospect theory and also a little bit of a thought exercise about how much you would pay someone or how much you would need to be paid in order to resolve the seat reclining airplane situation.